Welcome to today's webinar on how to restructure your church staff to develop next-gen leaders. I'm Sean, one of the ministry consultants at the Unstuck Group and your host. And before we get into today's content, let me introduce our panelists that are joining me here today. First of all, we have Tony Morgan. Tony, of course, is the founder and lead strategist here at the Unstuck Group. We started the Unstuck Group back in 2009 and now have served over 600 churches throughout the United States and several other countries around the world. And then I also have my teammate, Amy Anderson, here with us today. Amy has served as the director of consulting at the Unstuck Group since 2016. And during that time, she served over 150 churches, helping them to design their ministry strategy, staffing, and even multi-site strategies just to align and fuel their mission. So it's great to have both of you guys here with me today. Tony, I know you've had a lot of experience working with churches who've been really intentional about their leadership development structure. So can you share any insights of what you've learned?
Yeah, and especially as it relates to next generation leaders, Sean. I mean, I think this is personally a passion area for me, mainly because I had so many great opportunities as a young leader. First, in the marketplace roles that I had when I shouldn't have been in those types of roles. But then even my first roles in ministry, I'm recalling the days, both actually Sean and I served at the same church, though our time did not overlap near South Bend, Indiana. And Mark, our senior pastor, he was maybe 15, 20 years older than us. But he surrounded himself with a bunch of either late 20s or early 30s leaders and actually really empowered us to lead our areas of ministry. And I'm just seeing, even today, the churches that really seem to be having the greatest impact across multiple generations. It kind of doesn't matter how old the senior pastor is, as long as he or she is really intentional about making sure the leaders around them are representing all the different generations, including those next generations of leaders. So I'm looking forward to today's topic and just thinking about how staffing and structure, getting that right, can help us then begin to raise up that next generation of leaders.
So, Amy, same question for you. I know you've worked with a number of churches and have personal experience with this. Any insights you'd share just to get us started?
Yeah, I would just share with Tony, I am a product of leaders who invested in me when I was in that next generation leader. First, it was at 3M. I was 27 when I had the opportunity to go into management. And just by the way, they did a great job of growing me up into, part of who I am is because of the way they invested in me as a young leader. And then at my church, I guess I didn't feel young, but looking back, 33 was young. To be over the entire weekend experience and to sit on the executive team. And they gave me a shot and they empowered me and they didn't just set me free. They helped raise me up. But it's a beautiful thing. I was just with the church, Tony, and you serve this church too. And, the senior pastor's, a couple years older than us. But the rest of the team, they're all millennial leaders, Gen Z leaders, and man, the energy that was there, the culture that they've created, this team, they're just all hungry for more and they're going to get more. We just work through their, staffing and structure, but a great team. And then of course, I have worked with teams that had very little diversity. Very little age diversity on their leadership team, very little diversity in their experience and gender. And honestly, it's a little harder for them to ramp up, especially if they're in the maintenance phase, to get back to that strategic growth. You need those new ideas. You need that energy. So I'm super excited to talk about this topic today too.
Yeah, we actually decided to focus specifically on this topic because most churches right now are facing some pretty significant staffing challenges. Some examples. Many churches are either have overstaffing or vacancies in some key roles. That's creating problems, sometimes both of those at the same time. Churches are seeing that their org structure doesn't necessarily align with their new or post-pandemic ministry strategies, particularly when it comes to strategies to reach millennials and Gen Z. More and more churches are approaching or are kind of in the middle of the succession of a longtime pastor. Mm-hmm. And we've seen many churches that are struggling to fill vacant roles with high quality leaders because honestly, leadership development has kind of been pushed to the back burner, sometimes as a product of the pandemic and even pre-pandemic.
Yeah, you're so right, Sean. The truth is, most churches honestly are still living within these structures that have just evolved over time. In fact, I was just talking to a pastor. He's like, come help us because I'm not doing this right. I just keep kind of adding on people to our structure. And I think it's because, number one, the pace of ministry is different than any corporate environment. You know, churches, we have this final exam every week. And so I think pastors rarely want to disrupt, their team by changing roles and reporting structure. But we say this all the time, Tony, structure is a strategy, and you have to revisit it regularly with fresh eyes to make sure it's serving your mission, your vision, where you're going. And at the same time, we can't expect our ideal structure like this pastor to just evolve over time. And we can't expect the next generation of leaders in our church to be developed on accident. It simply doesn't happen. So church leaders need to see the connection between viewing structure as a strategy that changes, and it empowers young leaders by creating space for them in a structure that's aligned, of course, to their current ministry strategy.
Yeah, that's right, Amy. And we do have to remember that your structure is perfectly designed to get the results that you're seeing today. And there are some clear distinctions when we look at the data between how large growing churches are staffing compared to churches that are currently in decline. As examples, boomers generally are overrepresented on church staff teams right now. And smaller churches, though, have 50% more boomers on their staff team than larger churches, those churches that have more than 1,000 people attending. Let me give you another example. Gen Z adults are the generation that's most underrepresented right now on church staff teams. Yet large churches with more than 1,000 people, they employ 3 times as many young adults. So if you don't like the results you're seeing, you might have to change. I mean, after all, if we want the legacy of our leadership to outlive us, we have to focus on giving leadership away to the next generation. And many churches are concerned that they aren't reaching younger people, but they also aren't empowering younger leaders to help them figure that out.
So throughout today's conversation, here's the decision that we want to encourage you to make. Commit today to start the process of structuring your church to your strategy with an intentional focus on developing the leaders of the future. And we're going to walk through this conversation in 4 sequential steps. First of all, we're going to help you think through how to assess your current team health and performance. Secondly, how to evaluate your next-gen leadership capacity and potential. Third, how to structure to your strategy today. And then lastly, how to map out a potential future structure to begin preparing you for the handoff and leadership. So a few last details before we get into the content. First of all, we have, of course, chat and live Q&A going, just like we do every webinar. You can submit your questions that can be considered for our live Q&A at the end of today's webinar through the Q&A feature on Zoom. You can chat and just have the ongoing conversation happening with the chat feature. If you haven't downloaded the companion workbook for today's webinar, you can get it at theunstuckgroup.com/workbook, theunstuckgroup.com/workbook. We're going to be interacting in the chat to answer some questions via text and identify more of those questions to cover as we get to the live Q&A. But you can also share the conversation on social, either Twitter or Facebook. Just use the hashtag UnstuckChurch. That's hashtag UnstuckChurch. All right. So let's jump into step 1, assessing the current team health and performance. If you're going to restructure your church to more effectively empower next-gen leaders, you have to start here. If you skip assessment, you're going to make some mistakes in restructuring, and all restructuring mistakes necessarily have consequences that oftentimes end up hurting people. So, Tony, what are some of the reasons it's so critical to assess current team health and performance before you begin?
Yeah, Sean. So with that, let me maybe offer these 3 critical questions to assess your structure and the health of that structure. The first is this: does your structure support your ministry strategy? And this has to come first in any discussion about structure. Healthy churches change their structure when they change their strategy. In other words, they recognize that if vision or strategy changes, the structure must change. Otherwise, what happens is the legacy structure that's been in place will always revert back to previous vision and strategy. And with that, trying to fit fresh vision and strategy into an existing structure, it doesn't work. Leaders and teams will always gravitate back to what they've been hired to do and what the structure has been built to accomplish. And they will work hard to preserve what they know and avoid any change. So that's the first question. Does our structure support our ministry strategy? The second question we need to consider is, does our structure allow for our future growth and development? And what healthy churches have learned is they need to hire leaders rather than doers. They hire people who have the gift to build and lead volunteer teams to accomplish ministry. And if you take this approach, you can be developing the future senior leaders of your church while they serve in other aspects and positions throughout the ministry. I mean, they should understand that they are expected to lead now, and they should be given opportunities to lead at higher levels over time. And healthy churches also maintain an appropriate span of care. They make sure that every leader is managing the right number of staff and volunteers to accomplish their part of the mission while also caring for people on their team. And if your Gen X and Boomer senior leaders have a span of care that's too big, you're really missing opportunities to empower younger leaders to develop their management skills. So the second question again, does our structure allow for our future growth and development? And then lastly, question number 3, does our structure leverage the strengths and capacity, leadership capacity of the right people and in the right roles? And Sean, I know we're going to be talking about leadership capacity in a moment, but I think Amy is probably better positioned to talk about understanding employee strengths before we restructure.
Yeah. So Amy, what are some of the tools that you would recommend to help churches really get this right?
Sure. Well, one of my favorite assessment tools, and I've talked about it on previous webinars, is a disc-based assessment called Leading from Your Strengths. So if you're a regular listener of the Unstuck Church podcast, you've probably heard me talk about this before. But here's what I love about it. First, it reminds everybody of the natural approaches they have to problem solving, how they process information, how they manage change, and how they face risk. That's kind of the guts of the assessment. Because I say this all the time, intellectually, we know that we're all wired differently, but in reality, we often expect everyone to be just like us. So we talk to people like we want to be talked to. We expect things of people that we expect of ourselves. But the truth is that wiring is different in different people. So understanding the team's natural strengths helps the team work better together and also lean on one another, when a particular strength is needed. The second thing I love about it is that it's a visual tool to see how the entire team is wired. And this gives leaders perspective on if they have diversity of strengths, within their team, or if we're all wired similarly. Church teams that lack diversity, Tony, we know this, they're often stuck. And churches that have a diverse mix have a better opportunity to be healthy and maybe be helpful. I'll just show you a few examples of some teams I've worked with. So this first one here, this was a church I was just with. You can see they've got diversity around the wheel, but they're missing that driver quadrant, that leader or person who is focused on getting the task or mission accomplished, and they work at a faster pace. And often without a driver, we find that senior pastors usually feel like they have to do that then. They have to adapt from wherever they are on this wheel to cover that ground, to move the mission forward. And so common gap. And by the way, if you've been without a driver for a while, we have to be careful not to work them out of our team because they think differently. It's a strength to have that diverse gift on your team. The second one here, this was just funny. This has been several years, but when I worked with this church, you can see the challenge they have with lack of diversity on their team. Everybody is in that amiable quadrant. And I often joke, like they were the nicest team. I went home with, local maple syrup, but you can, this was part of the reason that this church was stuck because they didn't have the diversity. And maybe just one more. Again, this is common to be very bottom loaded on a ministry team. And I think that makes sense because a lot of us who, love Jesus and love the mission, we are people. We care about people. And so this is not uncommon to not have anyone north of that line, but look at how they adapted. This is where I say you can take a look at your team and see how we're all moving together. You can see we've got some people on the far right there that are truly expressives, but they are going due north to make sure we move the mission forward. And I'm assuming one of those two is the lead pastor. And again, that long line, it denotes stress. And what we really want to do is get a natural driver on that team so that those lines can shore up. And then look at the party in the analytic quadrant. So when this team took this assessment, virtually all but maybe 2 or 3 were completely working outside of their strengths. So I really like that tool. The other one I'll just mention is Working Genius. This has shown up a lot lately as I worked with teams, and even teams that I've worked with repeatedly. We dive into this one, but it's out of the table group. And it also is a great way to divvy out the diversity we have on our team. And so I'm just going to fly through it. It's got an acrostic called widget. It says we have 2 geniuses. There's a genius of wonder. I wonder what we should do. The I is invention. What could solve that problem we just wondered about? D is discernment. How do we discern all those inventions to get to the right one? G is galvanizing. We have to rally the troops. E is enablement, someone who takes it and moves it forward. And T is tenacity. And that's how we begin to run. This has been another great layer when I've been assessing teams. Tony, we worked with the same pastor, but I worked with a lead pastor with a big, fun personality. He was also Italian, Tony, so
yes,
you probably remember him well.
We all have big, fun personalities, Amy. Yes, that's true.
Yes, you do, just like Tony. But his geniuses were invention and galvanizing. And this is key because with invention, he is full of ideas, just a big personality. And he's a galvanizer. So he's very creative and he can rally people. So whatever hallway he was walking down, he was inventing and galvanizing. Well, there was no discernment in there. And the executive pastor was going crazy because we hadn't actually made a decision to do any of these things that he was inventing. So that helped that team. And it also helps understand how work gets done. So I just think using tools like these, Sean and Tony, they can be a critical step in uncovering potential in younger leaders that you haven't been fully tapping into until this point.
Yeah, Amy, it's fun to hear me talk or hear you talk about that. And it's actually reminding me of a story of a number of years ago. We were working with a pastor. In fact, it's kind of a famous pastor that several would know if you're watching the webinar today. And we were going through this process to help them identify the wiring of the different people on their teams. On the team. And the pastor realized after we went through this assessment, there was a significant gap. I do think, Amy, it was in that driver quadrant. And it was just like an awakening of, oh my goodness, now I'm understanding why we have faced some of the challenges that we've faced through the years. And it really was the beginning point for them to revisit their structure and get the right people in the right roles to be able to move their mission forward. So I love that when we get to be on the ground, helping pastors take a look at their team, because soon you start to see it becomes more visible, the opportunity you have then for creating really more of a fuller picture of the body of Christ that I think God intends for our ministries.
And that's why I like these 2 assessments. One is about that natural wiring. The second assessment is really more about how we get work done. It's about productivity because there's many of them out there, right? Choose one. But these 2 in particular, I think, help us identify what new leaders do we need to bring on our team and give new opportunities.
That's really helpful, Amy. We know from research over the past few years, in addition to just our experience working with churches, that there can sometimes be generational differences in where the priority is placed between health and performance on ministry staff teams. And our good friend Lance Witt, he's got a great book called High Impact Teams. And he promotes the idea that church teams shouldn't be about health or high performance, that it always needs to be both of those. So, Tony, what encouragement can you give to maybe Gen X and Boomer leaders who might lean towards performance over health? And then what encouragement would you give maybe to younger leaders who might lean maybe towards health more than performance?
Well, that's a fun question. So here's my perspective for the boomers and the Gen Xers, by the way, go Gen X, who are listening in. Here's my encouragement for you. You still need to provide strong leadership. You need to be thinking about healthy management. You need to be thinking about performance, really moving the mission forward. But you need to remember that next generation leaders really need more of a disciple maker and a mentor in their lives as well. And so with that, just be thinking about how you can take a more holistic approach to influence for those younger next generation leaders. And just remembering it's not just a ministry to do and a mission to accomplish. They're also looking for coaching for their lives. I mean, they're looking for health in all areas, not just their work, but primarily around also relational health and spiritual health. And the fact is, you have a lot of wisdom and experience to share, but you need to demonstrate that you're for the people you are leading before they will be open to your mentoring. For millennials and Gen Zers that are watching, by the way, thank you for contributing who you are to the mission of the church. God created you for a purpose, and you bring a unique wiring to the body of Christ. However, this is my encouragement for you, is just to remember there's a difference between being in the church and then being on a church staff team. Because of that, staff just have a greater role, a greater responsibility, both to do good work and to equip others to do the work of God. So if you want boomers and Gen Xers to empower you and to give you leadership and authority, you have to first earn their trust. And I'll just be honest, the best way that you can do that is to deliver results in the areas where you have responsibility. And then when you do that, you will likely enjoy a stronger voice to shape the health of the team, and you'll obtain influence that others in your generation, they won't experience, because first you've proven that you can be trusted in your leadership responsibilities. With that, let me just say again, we're talking about two sides of the equation here. Performance, there's a mission to be accomplished. And then health. We want to preserve the health on the team, the health of our relationships. But I just want to encourage you, don't try to fix a problem that doesn't exist. In other words, let's determine, do we have health on our team, and are we performing effectively as a team? And one way that you can kind of check that to make sure that you're healthy in both areas is to take our Unstuck Teams assessment. And here's the great thing. We're going to offer that for free for you, and you're going to receive a link after the webinar so that you can engage that Unstuck Teams assessment with your team for free. And so we'll give you the opportunity to take a look at that. And again, that'll be a way for you to confirm, are we both healthy and are we effectively performing? Are we effectively accomplishing the mission that God's given our church?
You know, in this first section, we've shared several different approaches that you can take to assessing the current team health and performance in your staff. And depending on what tools you've used recently, you might need to consider one of them or maybe all of them. So we're going to give you just a moment to reflect. And I want you to think through this question. Are you confident that you understand the strengths and gifting of every member of your team, especially of the younger staff members? Take about 60 seconds and think through that question, and then we'll come back with step 2. Okay, let's move on to step 2, evaluating the leadership capacity and potential that you currently have on your team. Tony, we're going through these sequentially. So why is this one specifically our recommended next step?
Well, Sean, that's really because healthy churches right-size their staff teams. In other words, specifically, they shoot for one full-time equivalent staff person for every 75 to 80 people in attendance. And if you're curious, does that include just ministerial staff or is that all staff? When we offer those benchmarks, it's considering every person on your staff team, regardless of their role. And that also includes comparing staffing to total average attendance, including adults, students, and kids. And what we've seen is healthy churches are able to have staffing ratios like that by hiring leaders rather than doers. They hire staff leaders who know how to identify and empower volunteer leaders and build volunteer teams. And with that, and this should be good news for all the staff people that are listening today, we encourage churches to be thinking about hiring fewer staff, but also paying those staff well. And what we've learned through the years is when you do that, it really does help you retain those high capacity staff members, which is certainly important as we think about both the current economic conditions, where it's just challenging with inflation and the rising costs in many areas, including staffing. But that's also an important consideration because the longer we can keep the high capacity staff people on our team, we create a legacy of ministry, and actually we see more momentum over time in those churches as well. Healthy churches, they elevate high capacity leaders of all different ages, and they recognize that all leaders are not created equal. There are different levels of leadership capacity. And just because someone can lead, as an example, doesn't necessarily mean they can lead a ministry department or they can lead a campus. So this is critical to get right during a restructure. And honestly, this is why growing churches sometimes have to restructure. Sometimes the leadership capacity required for certain roles changes as the church experiences growth. Healthy churches also create opportunities for younger people to have chances to lead and to gain experience. And many churches promote based on tenure rather than capacity. The challenge, of course, is if you take that approach, younger leaders are never going to get a chance to lead.
Amy, what are some of the tools that you've found help churches do this really well?
One of the key conversation that helps church leaders is what we call the leader assessment ledger. So using this assessment tool, we have leaders reflect on their team members and have them actually evaluate these team members' character, their chemistry, their competence, and their alignment to the team's culture. It's a diagnostic approach to understand where team members are thriving and where they need coaching and growth. And by the way, we all need feedback like this to get better. When we talk through their character, for example, this is foundational to everything else. When we assess character, we certainly look at more than morals. We also consider ethics, behaviors, attitudes. We ask, is this leader honest? Are they trustworthy? Are they a positive example to others? Do they allow others to shine? Or are they quick to anger, maybe overly impulsive or defensive when corrected? When we evaluate chemistry, of course, this is the quality of relationally working well with others. And we assess things like emotional intelligence, the ability to read a room, the ability to be a 360 leader so we can lead up laterally and down well. And do they understand the impact of their words and behaviors? Competence, of course, this is about getting their job well done. It includes things like self-motivation, diligence, the ability to prioritize, have a strong work ethic, a desire to learn. Business writer Patrick Lencioni, in his book, The Ideal Team Member, includes like this notion of being hungry. You know, when we evaluate competence, their eagerness to grow, their openness to new ideas, the ability to innovate. So those three areas are all critical for any leader. There's really no room for managing your weakness when it comes to character, chemistry, or competence. Every leader needs to be growing in those areas. One of my former colleagues, he often called this personal wisdom. So while we facilitate this with a team, this exercise is meant to be a self-reflection for any of us to kind of evaluate, boy, how's my character? How is my chemistry? How is my competence? And then how can I get better at those things? Because every leader needs to be strong. And then lastly, we assess their fit to the team's culture. And you can call this one organizational wisdom. And you need to have your culture defined if you're going to do this part. You know, we recommend 4 to 5 behaviors that reflect, as Seth Godin says, people like us do things like this. They're distinctive behaviors that really makes your team your team. And they are the behaviors that you want reflected throughout your entire organization. So for many of the leaders that I serve during our staffing and structure engagement, these conversations around those the four C's are really some of the most helpful conversation. It helps leaders put a finger on the development areas and how to coach and lead. And what I mean by that is it's a different coaching opportunity if someone is really high on competence, but low on chemistry, right? You would say something along these lines like, you're the best kids pastor in the country, right? This is not a competence issue, but I need to hold up the mirror and we need to work on how well you're relating with your peers or whatever the issue might be. Versus if someone's really high on character, but really low on competency, you coach that one different, right? Again, you say, this has nothing to do with your character. It's all really about getting the job done, the seat that you're in right now. So when we assess those areas and understand where the strengths and gaps are, it helps us coach those leaders better. And then I think the last note on this exercise, if you haven't historically done a great job of empowering younger leaders, or if you're at a smaller church with a smaller staff, you may need to also be thinking about younger volunteer leaders in this exercise. People that you're considering, like you said, Tony, that eventually may join the staff team someday. These conversations are great, even in those volunteer ranks. And then lastly, when we talk about leadership capacity, there are different levels of leadership. Back in my day, I grew up going to the Global Leadership Summit and hearing that everybody's a leader. But I want to push back and say, but not everyone has the same leadership capacity. When we look at Exodus 18, as we have conversations with churches, we're often talking about, who are those specialists who really lead themselves? Who are the people who are more in that lead by example, where they model? They're like a team lead level, right? They're still doing the job, whatever it is. Maybe it's ushering, but they're modeling for others how to do it. Those are the leaders of 10s. We have our leaders of 50, people who are really building volunteer teams. They are raising up other leaders. And then we have our people developers who are leaders of leaders. And then lastly, our catalytic leaders. So those are different capacities. I often share, I'm kind of a developer level. I lead leaders. I'm really not a catalytic leader. That's not my capacity. So I should probably never be a lead pastor. But as you said, Tony, eventually as the organization grows, we're going to hit some lids with our current leaders because their leadership capacity isn't there. And so I just encourage you to, think through who are on our staff right now, who are the leaders of 10s, 50s, 100s, thousands, and identify who has that upward potential. Those are good conversations, again, even within the volunteer ranks or with your younger leaders, because you might have someone who's kind of a leader of 10s right now, but man, you actually could see them, a decade down the line. They've got that catalytic gift. They're going to be there. So in some respects, it's our responsibility to begin to give those people with higher leadership capacity opportunities to develop those muscles.
So as we wrap up step 2 here, we want to give you just a moment to jot down the first 3 names that come to your mind of younger leaders at your church, either staff or volunteers, that you feel like have the character, capacity, competency, and that culture fit to lead at a higher level than you're currently asking them to lead. So you don't have to know what that next position is for them that they should be in yet. We're just looking at identifying the capacity for leadership. Okay, so we're going to give you about 60 seconds, jot down those first 3 names. All right, step 3, let's get to some of the best practices for actually designing new structure that really matches and supports your ministry strategy, and then also creates opportunity for empowering younger leaders. Tony, what does a ministry structure that supports the ministry strategy actually look like?
Yeah. Again, great question, Sean. And it's actually, I mean, it's such a complex issue, and there are many directions I could go here, but let me share a few key thoughts. The first, and let's take a look at this graphic. What it shows is the way churches commonly approach structure. First, they think about who's on the team. They think about people. Then they align all of those people in a structure. Honestly, many times it's based on existing relationships and kind of what people most enjoy doing and where their gifts are. But they're kind of putting people into a structure that fits for the people. And then they figure out, what can we do then? What mission can we accomplish? What's the strategy that we can engage? Other churches, though, we would say healthy churches reverse this. And what they're thinking first about is, what's the strategy that we need to engage to accomplish our mission? Then what structure best helps us accomplish that strategy? And then what people do we need within that structure to move our mission forward? And so that's one aspect, is we think strategy, then structure, then people. A second thought related to structure is healthy churches structure for both their reach strategy and their discipleship strategy. And I'll just say, we have learned through the years, we really have to highlight this, because honestly, most churches out there, when we go in, they're just thinking about spiritual formation. They're just thinking about discipleship. In other words, all they're thinking about related to their structure is, once people connect to the church, how do we help them take their next steps towards Christ? And that's important. But what those churches are doing then is neglecting the intentionality of what our strategy needs to look like to reach people that are currently outside the faith and outside the church. And so we need to make sure the structure actually reflects both our reach strategy and our discipleship strategy. And let me just suggest that your reach strategy team needs to have some younger leaders on that team if you're trying to reach younger people as a church. A third thought to consider as it relates to structure is that healthy churches link every ministry to the senior leadership team. In other words, there are no silo ministries that aren't connected and aligned to the rest of the ministry and to the rest of the team. And again, I wouldn't be talking about this if we hadn't seen many examples through the years of ministries, and we've seen difference. Like sometimes it's a men's ministry that's not really connected to the rest of the ministry team, or a women's ministry, or a missions ministry, or a student ministry, whatever the case might be. Not making sure that every leader is somehow connected to the senior leadership team, so that we're staying aligned in our ministry strategies to accomplish our mission. And let me just say, related to these three key things when it comes to structure, and then certainly in several other areas, this is hard to do on your own. And I think the reason why is we have relational connection with people in our teams. And because of that, then there's some emotional weight that comes with making structure changes and people changes. But getting this right is worth the investment of bringing in some outside help to help you really think maybe more, less emotionally about some of the changes that need to happen in our structure and with people to support the mission that God's called us to as churches. And honestly, too, I mean, one of the key things here is just making sure that through these structure changes, we have a staffing budget that is sustainable for the future too, and just making sure we can make the appropriate investment in our staff team in light of the resources God has provided for our ministry.
That's well said, Tony. It's hard to be objective when we're making decisions for people that we're close to. Yeah. Amy, I wonder if you could just show some examples of church org structures that really illustrate some of these points of what effective and maybe ineffective staffing structure looks like.
Sure. Let me pull this first one up. This is a church I served, I think back in 2019. And as I look at this, I color coded it because I wanted to show you how dispersed the various ministry lanes were. There weren't lanes, how dispersed the ministry staff were. So this is three great leaders at the top, all about the same age, all the same gender, all the same. Okay, great people, all the same. But underneath them, I believe their starting point here was, I think they staffed based on personality, Tony, or like expertise. Like this person has a little bit of this, so we're going to put them under this leader, this leader. Because if you look at the yellow boxes, those would all be things that I would consider kind of reaching new people positions. So communications, worship, teaching. And then the blue boxes there are what I would call the discipleship roles. Student minister, care minister, guest services groups, discipleship and missions and equipping. Those are dispersed between these two leaders. And the gray boxes are what I would call kind of the operational lane or the support areas for this church. And so this is where they started. But they, number one, at the top of the org chart, they lack some diversity. And as we cleared up their ministry lanes and restructured their church, I was so proud of them because they grabbed one of their younger leaders. I think she was in her late 20s, and I did the secret shopper there too. And I could tell she had some great leadership skills, and she had just a vibrant personality. Well, she was a leader. They moved her into a senior leader role when we went through this. Today, she's leading one of their life centers. Just 4 years later. And so they took a chance with her through the restructure, and she is one that just soared and moved through the ranks. Another example I could show you is, this is actually a team I'm going to be working with here soon, so I'm just starting to delve into their current structure. And as I look at this, the obvious challenge here is span of care, Tony, that you talked about earlier, and they're aware of this, right? But this is somewhere where as they grew, they just kept adding direct reports to that administrative pastor. I could erase the administrative pastor, and I've seen org charts where all these people also report to the senior pastor. So it happens in both of those roles. But you can tell with a structure like this, we are not going to be developing leaders. The administrative pastor here is going to be checking boxes just to make sure the work is getting done. But he or she is not going to have time to develop all those people. And because that's not being modeled, my guess is that that's not also going to funnel down to that next level of leadership in their leadership ranks. So to their credit, this is probably why they reached out, and we're going to delve into this. But again, we're going to think through, Tony, the principles that you talked out, aligning their structure to their ministry strategies, clearing up some of these ministry lanes, and then looking for who are the people we can elevate into leadership. And I should just note, when you restructure, just a couple other things that are on my mind. Number one, figuring out your new meeting rhythms. Tony, you said in so many words, you can't put, new wine in old wineskins. When you restructure, that is a great time to reset your meeting rhythms. These are, again, things we talk about during our staffing and structure review. And also bringing clarity to, and we didn't show it today, but that action level of the pyramid. This is a key staffing and structure area for a healthy team, to take your organizational goals and get those broken down by ministry teams and then actually to a person, so everyone understands how their work connects to the overall mission of the church.
Amy, it's fun for me to hear you talk through this, because I've seen you firsthand work with so many churches through this process to make sure that their structure is the right structure to help the church move forward in its mission. And I've seen the smile on senior pastors' faces when they finally feel like somebody is coming in to help them make the sometimes tough decisions on getting the right people in the right roles. And I'm just so grateful for you and the rest of the team at the Unstuck Group that really works hard on these staffing and structure reviews to make sure we get the right structure in place for churches to be able to move their mission forward. So thanks for the work that you do.
Yeah, thanks, Sonny.
So before we move on to thinking about future structures, we want to give you another moment to reflect. And I want you to think through these questions. Does your current org chart effectively support your ministry strategy? What jumped out at you through this conversation of maybe an area that you can improve? Take about 60 seconds or so, write down a few thoughts, and then we'll come back with step 4. Amy, many churches that are listening in today might not be in a position to hire or to promote a lot of next gen leaders right away. But we hope that the takeaway today is just an understanding of how necessary it is to be planning for it and to create space for younger leaders in how you structure. So how would you encourage pastors to map out a potential maybe future structure and begin preparing for that handoff in leadership?
Sure. Well, it all starts, before we get to future structures, you have to first do the work we just talked about, which started with aligning your current structure to your ministry strategies. But future structures are kind of a fun conversation. I do this with every church that is either multi-site or thinking about going multi-site. We don't just talk through what does the structure look like at this phase one, but we'll play it out 2 or 3 or 4 phases. And the purpose of that is we want the church to know now what leaders do we need to be looking for as we grow, so that when we get to this stage, we haven't just, again, started putting them into our structure, but we actually have a staffing structure plan for the next iterations of our organization. And so that's what I would encourage leaders to do when we think about future structure is take your current attendance and then throw, 10% growth over 5 years and see where you land. Maybe it's 20 with how we're coming out of the pandemic, or whatever growth you're expecting God to bring to your church. Play that number forward and now determine how many staff will we have based on those ratios, right? Divide it by 75 to figure out our FTE. And then let's figure out what phase 2 structure might look like. And then do it again for phase 3. And just let me give you a practical example. Let's say as a church right now that you have in the discipleship area, maybe there's 2 people that are dedicated to discipleship. Maybe one's over groups and one's over kind of local and global outreach. Maybe that's how you've divvied out. And then they share the rest of the responsibilities. As I would think about that team, if that team doubled, what new leaders would I put on that team? Immediately what comes to my mind is a serving director, someone who's going to oversee how people, when they raise their hand to serve, how they get signed up, how they get first serve opportunities, how we define our volunteer leadership tiers, all those types of things. So we probably add a serving director. And then, what's the 4th position? So if we have groups serving kind of missions area, well, maybe we need fill in the blank at our church in the discipleship area. Just by making those priorities known and on some long list for hires, you can be thinking when you meet a good leader, a good young leader, when are we ready to maybe give them an option to pick up that on our discipleship team? So just playing the movie forward, Tony, I remember when you talked about when you were launching your first multi-site location, how the campus pastor had all those Post-its up, because he thought through, how many volunteers do I need? How many team leaders do I need? How many coaches do I need? In a sense, that's what we're asking you to do. Build out your church when it's whatever, double the size it is now. How is our structure going to change? And it'll help you have good insight into what leaders you're looking for.
Tony, what practical things would you encourage specifically Gen X and Boomer pastors to start doing to more effectively develop young leaders and to think through that leadership pipeline?
Yeah, Sean, let me maybe offer 2 don'ts and a do here. So the first don't over-engineer leadership development. We have to be intentional about it, but I think sometimes churches overthink what leadership development needs to look like, and they want it to be kind of the perfect model for leadership development, and they invest so much time on that they never actually accomplish any leadership development. And so, from Scripture, the model of Paul and Timothy is probably the best one that we can see as far as preparing a young leader for leadership in the ministry and in the church. And I'm guessing Paul didn't have a specific leadership pipeline. He didn't have a curriculum all mapped out for all the different things that he was going to lead Timothy through to prepare him for leadership. But it was a very intentional strategy to pour into Timothy. So don't over-engineer it. The second don't is don't over-rely on teaching for leadership development. Teaching is important to leadership development, but if I had to guess, I'm thinking maybe it's only 10%, 15% of what a next generation leader needs in order to prepare that next generation leader for future roles and responsibilities in the church. So don't over rely on teaching. And then the do take advantage of come follow me moments. And let me give you an example of this. I mentioned this on one of our recent podcasts, but I recently invited Dan Zimbardi, who's the executive pastor at Sandals Church in Southern California, to come onto the podcast and to talk about leadership development. And when I asked him to join us, he responded with these words, and I wrote them down because I thought, I need to repeat this. This is what Dan said. I'd love to do it. It's one of my favorite topics, but I have one caveat. I'd like to do the podcast with Tim. Tim has come up through our leadership system, and he's now our director of people and culture. And part of my strategy for equipping is to bring young leaders to as many significant meetings and presentations as possible to accelerate their development. And I love that because it's an example of a leader that is in my generation looking for a come follow me moment and inviting that leader to join him. And through that experience, giving that leader some development opportunity for when they step up into greater leadership roles. So if you want to empower next generation leaders, we have to equip them, but we also have to invite them along for the journey. And to use Dan's words, that's how we accelerate their development. So just as Dan was a good role model for this type of equipping, Jesus, I think, modeled this from the very beginning of launching his ministry on earth. He invited the disciples, come follow me, and I will send you out to fish for people. So as you think about next generation leaders, I would consider specifically opportunities like this. For a young leader, come follow me to this conference that I'm going to so that we can learn together. Come follow me to this meeting that we're about to have. And I want you to listen in, but I also want you to ask questions and challenge our thinking in this conversation. Come follow me to this tough conversation that I need to have with someone in our congregation. Another one, come follow me to this ministry opportunity that I have at another church, and we can together kind of experience what's happening in this other ministry. Or come follow me to pray with a family who's currently going through a crisis. We need to be very intentional about looking for those come follow me moments so that we can raise up that next generation of leaders in our churches.
That's very good. Okay, here's one last moment for reflection before we move on to the live Q&A. Related to preparing for the future, what's the most urgent thing that you need to tackle? Is it succession planning? Maybe developing a leadership development pipeline? Maybe it's mapping out a future structure for multi-site expansion. Take just a few seconds and write down what that next critical thing is, the most urgent thing that you need to tackle. Then we'll be back for live Q&A. All right, Amy. Well, we have just a couple of questions that came in here for through the live Q&A. We're going to wrap up just last 6 minutes of our time together going through those. And I think this first one is right up your alley. This is going to be a perfect one for you. Are you ready?
I'm ready.
All right. Brian asked this, any tips on how to assess the current structure to support your vision?
Sure, that's a great question. You know, when I think about, we talk about aligning our structure to our current strategies, I would say
what are your major strategies to accomplish your vision, and then make sure you have owners for each of those strategies. Meaning, someone on your team has to own each one of your major ministry strategies. If multiple people own it, then you just don't get the traction. Of course, our joke on the podcast all the time is, this is not a good joke. How do you kill a dog, right? Give 8 people the responsibility to feed it, right?
Yeah.
Everyone thinks someone else is doing it. And so I think you could evaluate your structure and go, do I have leaders over the key ministry strategies that our church is using to accomplish that vision? And just a couple of other things within that, do we have like that org chart I showed that was all scattered? Are we aligning and creating clear ministry lanes for those leaders? And then, of course, do we have the appropriate span of care within there?
Yeah, very good, Amy. That's perfect. Odalis had a question about the assessments, and I'm going to kind of paraphrase his question, but how do you take the assessments, and is it possible to kind of integrate those at a volunteer level? And if you do, and you have a large number of volunteers, how do you do that without the costs getting out of hand?
Sure. Well, I love that question, because the discovery we have, when we work with like a team of 12 leaders on a team, it's funny because those leaders don't work together, for the reason, however, we have the participants in the room. So many of our churches then take those assessments to their actual teams to see how each team is made up, and it exposes, strengths, and it exposes gaps. But I get the cost issue. I mean, these assessments, if you went right to the websites to grab them, are somewhere in the neighborhood of $25 to $40 a piece. So if you take that through a large volunteer organization, I can see how the cost could get away with you. But what we use at the Unstuck Group from the Ministry Insights, that disc-based assessment, right? You've got the D, the I, the S, and the C. If you've done the animal kingdom, you've got the lions and the otters and the golden retrievers and the beavers. So they've been named different things. North Point Church just did a whole thing on the colors, and they're all the same science. They're all the same assessment. So I remember I used to actually just go online. We use social styles, which is drivers, expressives, amiable, analytics. And there's actually some free downloadable assessments people can use to just kind of self-assess. Of course, you don't get the robust report you get like from Ministry Insights that we work with. But if you understand the assessment, you'll be able to have people self-assess, and you can take a look at those teams.
Yeah, excellent. Another question, Amy, just a couple more minutes. We'll try to get these in. But Tommy asked, how did you, on the example earlier of the structure work that you did that you were talking through, how did you effectively reduce the number of direct reports? He mentioned to the administrative pastor specifically, but maybe how do you go about reducing those?
Sure. Well, he for sure had way too many direct reports, even admitted it. He just can't do development when we have that many direct reports.
Yeah.
And what was happening is everybody just reported underneath him, the other ministry leaders. So what we did was we cleared up ministry lanes, and we grouped some of those discipleship responsibilities under one discipleship leader that reported to that administrative pastor. When we looked at like the weekend and the artistic areas, communications, grouping some of those under the right leader that just reported that administrative pastor. And, we brought that down to, I think, 4 to 5 direct reports for that administrative pastor, where now he actually can function as kind of the executive pastor. He can conduct the ministry versus just trying to, he described himself as a bottleneck to the team because everything kind of went through him, but his span of care then was so large that by having fewer direct reports, he truly can conduct and help that team execute on their vision now.
Yeah, absolutely. Great answers, Amy. One thing I noticed about the questions that came through today was while we were talking kind of about different generations and the next generation specifically, a lot of the questions came back to those common staffing and structure questions that we get. And this has been a big theme for us over the last few years, part of all that's happened through the pandemic, the great resignation, a lot of change, and a lot of questions just about church staffing. And there was one question that came through, does the Unstuck Group help churches with that? Absolutely, we do. Amy leads a great team who helps churches on site navigate through these difficult staffing and structure type conversations. And so while that necessarily wasn't the point of today's webinar, we were focused on next generation leadership. If that's something we can help your team with, we certainly would love to do that. Anything that we can help with, you can visit us at theunstuckgroup.com and get more information there. You can start a conversation with us if you're interested in having us help you on site. Just hit that Start Here button at the top of the screen, and that's the best way to start a conversation with us. We're going to wrap up today's webinar. We're right at the hour, but we thank everybody for joining us. Hopefully the content was helpful. We will send out the replay video so that everybody can watch it and share it if needed. You can continue the conversation online on social using the hashtag UnstuckChurch, and we hope to see you on a future webinar. Have a great day, everybody.